In the heart of the dense, dark forest stood a forgotten cabin, its weathered exterior blending seamlessly with the shadowy trees that surrounded it. Brian, a seasoned explorer with a penchant for unraveling mysteries, stumbled upon this eerie abode during one of his excursions. Despite the warnings echoing in his mind, Brian's curiosity got the best of him, and he ventured inside. The interior was as bleak as the exterior, filled with cobwebs and dust, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. As Brian sifted through the debris, he stumbled upon a journal, its pages yellowed with age. With trembling hands, he began to read the entries, each one recounting the harrowing experiences of a previous inhabitant who had sought refuge in the cabin. The entries spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, whispers in the night, fleeting shadows, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. Despite the writer's attempts to leave the forest behind, it seemed to have a grip on them, refusing to let go. Determined to uncover the truth, Brian resolved to spend the night in the cabin, hoping to experience firsthand the mysteries that plagued the forest. As darkness descended, so did an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Hours passed, and just as Brian began to doubt the tales he had read, he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible yet unmistakably present. Goosebumps prickled his skin as he strained to make out the words, each syllable sending a shiver down his spine. Suddenly, the cabin was engulfed in darkness, the feeble glow of Brian's flashlight flickering ominously. Heart pounding, he fumbled for the door, only to find it stuck fast, as if held shut by an unseen force. Panic rising, Brian desperately sought an escape, but the forest seemed to have other plans. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, whispering secrets too dreadful to comprehend. Just when he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, the first light of dawn pierced the darkness, banishing the malevolent spirits that had haunted the night. With trembling hands, Brian wrenched open the door, fleeing the cabin and the forest behind him. But as he emerged into the light of day, he knew that the horrors of the dark forest would linger with him forever, a chilling reminder of the thin line between curiosity and madness. As Brian stumbled out of the forest, his mind reeling from the night's horrors, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every shadow seemed to whisper his name, every rustle of leaves echoed with unseen threats. Unable to bear the weight of his fear alone, Brian sought solace in the company of others, desperate for reassurance that he hadn't lost his grip on reality. But try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister still lingered in the depths of the forest, waiting patiently for its next victim. Haunted by the events of that fateful night, Brian vowed never to return to the dark forest, knowing that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Yet even as he tried to move on with his life, he couldn't escape the feeling that the forest's secrets were far from buried. Years passed, but the memory of that night never faded. Brian became consumed by an insatiable curiosity, a burning desire to understand the true nature of the dark forest and the forces that dwelled within it. And so, against his better judgment, Brian found himself drawn back to the forest's edge, his resolve steeling as he prepared to confront the darkness once more. Armed with newfound determination and a determination to uncover the truth, Brian ventured into the heart of the forest, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him. But whether he would emerge unscathed or fall victim to the same fate as those who came before him remained to be seen. For in the dark forest, where shadows danced and whispers echoed, nothing was ever as it seemed, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred into oblivion. Sarah had always loved the solitude of the woods. Every summer, she would retreat to her family's cabin deep in the forest, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. This year was no different. She packed her bags, loaded up her car, and drove the 3 hours to the isolated cabin that held so many childhood memories. The dense trees and winding paths felt like home. The cabin was just as she remembered, rustic and cozy, with a large porch that overlooked the thick forest. She spent the first day settling in, unpacking her things, and making a list of the supplies she needed to pick up from the nearby town. The next morning, Sarah decided to take a long hike to reacquaint herself with the trails. She set out with her backpack, filled with water, snacks, and her old compass, just in case. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. She breathed in the fresh air, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. As she walked deeper into the forest, she noticed something strange. The birds had stopped singing. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around but saw nothing unusual, just trees and shadows. Shaking off her unease, she pressed on, telling herself it was just her imagination. After a few hours of hiking, Sarah found a small clearing with a large flat rock that was perfect for resting. She sat down, pulled out her water bottle, and took a long drink. That's when she heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. She froze, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, closer. Her heart began to race. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the sound of the leaves crunching underfoot. She stood up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The forest was eerily silent. She decided it was time to head back to the cabin. As she started to walk, the rustling began again, following her. She quickened her pace, her anxiety mounting. By the time she reached the cabin, she was almost running. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her chest heaving with fear. She peered out the window, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. She felt a bit silly. Maybe it was just an animal, she thought. The rest of the evening was uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She kept the cabin well lit and double-checked the locks before going to bed. Despite her best efforts, she found it hard to sleep. Every little noise made her jump. The next day, Sarah decided to stick closer to the cabin. She spent the morning chopping wood and tidying up the yard. As she was stacking logs, she noticed something on the edge of the clearing, a small carved wooden figure. It was crudely made, with no discernible features, but it sent a chill down her spine. She picked it up and examined it closely. There was no way it had been there the previous day. Someone had to have left it. But who and why? That night, the noises started again. Sarah lay in bed, listening to the faint rustling outside her window. It felt like whatever was out there was getting closer, bolder. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But sleep eluded her. In the early hours of the morning, just as she was drifting off, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping on the window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay still, straining to hear. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She got out of bed and crept to the window, her hands shaking. She pulled back the curtain and screamed. There, pressed against the glass, was a pale face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. She stumbled back, her mind reeling with terror. When she looked again, the face was gone. Sarah spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching a fireplace poker. She didn't sleep a wink. In the morning, she decided she couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. She packed her bags and loaded them into the car. As she was about to leave, she found another wooden figure on the porch, identical to the first. She threw it into the woods and sped down the dirt road, her heart racing. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. She didn't look back. Sarah vowed never to return to the cabin. The memories that once brought her peace were now tainted with fear. She never found out who or what was in the forest, and she hoped she never would. The woods that she once loved had become a place of nightmares, a dark forest that held secrets she was better off not knowing. Sarah drove for what felt like hours, her mind racing as fast as her car. Every shadow on the road seemed to twist and reach out for her, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead, focusing on getting away. When she finally reached the small town on the outskirts of the forest, She pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and took a moment to catch her breath. The cashier, a friendly older man, noticed her distress and asked if she was okay. Sarah managed a weak smile and nodded, though she knew she must have looked as terrified as she felt. "That forest has its share of legends," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "People say it's haunted, that spirits linger there. I've heard stories of folks disappearing, strange figures seen at night. Best to stay away from there." Sarah shuddered. "Have you ever heard of anyone leaving wooden figures around?" The man's face grew pale. "Wooden figures? You mean like little carved dolls?" Sarah nodded. He leaned in closer. "There's an old story about that. They say those figures are warnings. If you find one, it means something is watching you, marking you. You need to leave, and quickly. You're lucky to have gotten out." Sarah thanked the man and hurried back to her car, her mind racing with fear and confusion. In the safety of her motel room, Sarah locked the door and tried to calm her racing thoughts. She took a hot shower, hoping it would soothe her nerves, but the memories of the past few days lingered like a dark cloud. As she lay in bed, she couldn't help but check the windows and the door repeatedly, ensuring they were securely locked. Sleep finally came, but it was restless and filled with nightmares. She dreamt of the forest, of being chased by shadowy figures, of wooden dolls that came to life and whispered in her ear. When she woke, drenched in sweat, she knew she couldn't run from this fear forever. She had to understand what had happened, to find a way to put it behind her. The next day, Sarah drove to the nearest library and began researching the forest's history. She discovered that the area had been the site of several mysterious disappearances over the years. Locals believed the forest was cursed, that malevolent spirits dwelled within it, drawn to those who wandered too deep. As she delved deeper, she found an old newspaper article about a family who had lived in a cabin in the forest over 50 years ago. The family had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a series of carved wooden figures. The article mentioned that the figures were thought to be a form of warning, though no one knew for sure who or what had left them. Sarah's heart raced as she read. Could the same thing have happened to her family? Had they unknowingly been living in a place marked by some ancient malevolent presence? Determined to find answers, Sarah contacted a local historian who had written extensively about the forest. She arranged to meet him at a cafe in town. The historian, an elderly man named Mr. Harlan, listened intently as Sarah recounted her experiences. "You were wise to leave when you did," Mr. Harlan said, his voice grave. "Many who encounter those figures are not so fortunate. They are believed to be a warning from the spirits that inhabit the forest. Those who ignore the warning often disappear, never to be seen again." Sarah shivered. But why? What do they want? Mr. Harlan shook his head. "No one knows for certain. Some believe the spirits are the souls of those who died tragically in the forest, bound to it by their suffering. Others think they are something older, more ancient, and malevolent. Whatever they are, they do not take kindly to intruders." Sarah left the meeting with more questions than answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never return to that forest. The cabin, once a place of solace, was now a dark and haunting memory. As she drove back to the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing at the edge of the road. But there was nothing, only the long, empty stretch of highway. Years passed, and Sarah built a new life for herself, far from the shadow of the dark forest. She found solace in the city, surrounded by people, and the comforting noise of urban life. Yet, on quiet nights, when the wind howled through the streets and the shadows grew long, she would sometimes wake with a start, her heart pounding, convinced she heard the faint, distant sound of tapping on her window. And in those moments, she would remember the forest, the wooden figures, and the face at the window.